Somebody in the audience has my name. There are two Abbas Walis.
Oh,
I don't know why he is using my name, or probably doesn't know. Somebody in the audience has my name.
It happens when you forward your email to anyone. So.
oh, yeah, that's one possibility.
I don't know why he is using my name, or probably doesn't. Somebody in the audience.
Yeah, very likely to maybe you forwarded the email to someone else, and then when they click on that, then automatically it has your name. So that's the point. So we will start officially, and apart from the panelist and moderator, I will ask you kindly to turn off your camera. So good afternoon, good morning, everyone. So thank you very much for being with us. Already we have roughly speaking about 35 people here, although about 180 people they registered for the meeting. They will show up slowly but surely. So we will start this webinar, which is very important to all Iranians. And kindly we ask three esteemed speakers and scientists in this field to join us and provide their feedback and thoughts, and also is there information which will help us to understand better about the governance system. And kindly we have these three speakers, Professor Wali, Professor McCaw, and Professor Lecoq. And the structure will be described by Ali, Dr. Ali Reza Rezaifar. Just want to tell you, for the people that they have limited knowledge of English, this can be, you can activate the interpretation. On the lower side of your Zoom room, there is a sign or symbol of interpretation, which is the word sign. Go and click on this, and you will choose the language that you want to hear. So you should activate in Persian. So I will say this in Farsi. این میتینگ به زبان فارسی هم ترجمه خواهد شد. برای اینکه ترجمه رو بشنوید لطفاً برید به پایین صفحه زومتون. اگه با کامپیوتر هستید، اگه با کامپیوتر نیستید، روی مور کلیک کنید. یک شکلی هست به اسم کره زمین. اونو که بزنید برید روی فارسی، پرژین. اگه اونو بزنید به زبان فارسی صحبت ها رو خواهید شنید که دکتر فرزی ترجمه خواهند کرد. و بعد از اون، بعد از 3 تا سخنرانی هم ما پرسش و پاسخ خواهیم داشت. دستتون رو بالا ببرید، من اکتیویتتون میکنم، میاید بالا. به مدت 2 دقیقه سوالتون رو، ماکسیموم 2 دقیقه سوالتون رو میپرسید، یا اگه سوالتون نمیخواید بپرسید روی Q&A بنویسیدش. بعد از اون مدریتور اینا رو پیکاپ میکنه و کوهاست هم کمکشون میکنن و بعد برنامه رو ادامه خواهیم داد. سپاسگزارم. علی جان لطفاً شما شروع کنید، من ویدیومو خاموش میکنم.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. Today we are with you with 3 highly qualified panelists, and I'm gonna introduce each one of them at the time when they provide you with their presentation. And like Ibrahim mentioned, we will have Q&A, question and answer panel right after the 3rd presentation. So if you kindly write your questions, we will get to them, or maybe the panelists, because the panelists also have access to the QA, maybe they provide the answer right there. So that's another possibility. And with this, let's start with Professor André Lecoq. André Lecoq is president of the Canadian Political Science Association and fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. His main research interests are nationalism and federalism. He's the editor of New Institutionalism, Theory and Analysis, published by the University of Toronto Press in 2005, as well as Basque Nationalism and the Spanish State, University of Nevada Press, 2007. He's also the co-author of Nationalism and Social Policy, The Politics of Territorial Solidarity, Oxford University Press, 2008. Also, he is the co-author of Fiscal Federalism and Equalization Policy in Canada, Political and Economic Dimensions, as well as Nationalism, Secessionism, and Autonomy, Oxford University Press, 2021. Now, when he is not writing books and essays, or he's not actively participating in public discussions like this one, he teaches at the University of Ottawa, where he is professor in the School of Political Studies. Thank you, Dr. Lecour, for accepting our invitation. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Ali. It's my great pleasure to be here. And as Ali mentioned about my research interest, which hint a little bit at the content of my presentation, I'm really interested in diversity. I'm interested in how diversity, especially in the form of groups who claim homelands within a state. I'm interested in how this diversity in these groups are managed. And, I'm not a specialist of Iran. I'm not overly familiar with the country, but I want to discuss with you a potential new idea or new model for governing a potentially reformed Iran. I will now share my screen with you. And that idea, that model is federalism. And that's a concept with which Canadians, I'm sitting here in Ottawa, the capital of Canada, it's a concept with which Canadians are very well acquainted, because Canada was one of the first federations to be created. So there's not all that many federations around the world, but there's certainly very well-known countries like the United States, like Canada, of course, Australia, Germany, India, and so on and so forth. And so one of the first things I did when I was invited to give this talk is take a look at the makeup of Iran society in terms of, again, it's historical, culturally distinct communities. And I guess not knowing the country all that well, I was a little bit surprised because Iran is actually quite a diverse country. And of course, there's a Persian majority in the country, but there's also many other different groups who historically have been inhabiting parts of the territory. And these types of countries, in a liberal democratic context, especially, tend to at least think about federalism, and I'll explain why they do and why this might be something that a reformed Iran could consider. So, what is federalism? Let's start with that.
Professor Lecour, I'm sorry to interrupt you. So, from the speaker, from the audiences, they are asking you to put the slides in the presentation mode, please. Yeah.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, federalism is at least a couple of things. First, it's an idea. It's a political idea. It's an approach to governance. An approach that involves combining self-rule and shared rule. So with federalism, you have the notion of different communities enjoying some measure of autonomy, some measure of self-rule, but at the same time coming together to govern the state as a whole. So exercising shared rule. And federalism as an idea aims at fostering unity within diversity, right? So federalism as an idea believes that unity can exist and thrive in diversity, that you don't need homogeneity. You don't need everybody to be the same to be united. So that's really at the basis of federalism as an idea. Federalism is also a system of territorial structuring. So federalism involves a constitutional division of powers between levels of government. So with federalism, you have powers and responsibilities that are divided between levels of government, at least 2 levels. And this division of powers is written in a constitution, which means that it cannot be changed by one or the other level of government unilaterally. So why is federalism useful from a democratic perspective, right? One is that federalism involves a division of political power, a fragmentation of political power, a check on political power. And as liberal Democrats, I mean, that's what we want. Right? We don't want a concentration of political power. So there are some federations around the world that have been created with the express purpose of providing checks on political power, dividing political power to help foster democracy. The United States is the oldest historical example of that. And Germany is a more contemporary one, post-World War II Germany. Now, in a democratic context, federalism is also an approach and a tool for managing diversity, specifically territorial diversity. When you look at a lot of other federations in the world, from Canada to Switzerland, India, Belgium, even the newest federation of Nepal, we see the rationale for their existence in terms of the necessity to manage diversity in a liberal democratic context. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. That's really going to be the crux of my talk. So liberal democratization and the management of territorial diversity. So, you know, when states transition from authoritarianism, it involves typically greater freedom of expression, the construction of a rights regime, and eventually free and fair elections. Now, when you have a state, a country, where there's a lot of territorial diversity, meaning that there are territorially concentrated and linguistically, ethnically, or religiously distinct communities from the majority community that typically controls the state, the process of liberal democratization usually takes a little bit of a different look, because these communities will tend to use their newly found freedom of expression, of assembly, of participation to make some claims to the state, some collective claims. And again, in the process of liberal democratization, some of the typical strategies of authoritarian state to manage territorial diversity, right? Repression, population exchanges, so-called ethnic cleansing, become no longer accessible. So the state has to rethink how it manages territorial diversity. So when these historical territorial communities make claims to the state, you know, the liberal democratic state has several tools in its toolkits. Again, it can't do repression, it cannot overtly assimilate, it can offer rights protection, both individual and collective rights. That's one option. It can overrepresent minority communities within central institutions. So if a minority community has been historically oppressed and repressed, marginalized, perhaps that community can gain, for example, in the central parliament, a greater number of seats than its demographic weight would warrant. That's a possibility. Sometimes the state, although that's difficult for state, the state will recognize that in its midst there is a distinct community. Sometimes, most of the time, these communities, they want to be called nation. So states can find a way to formally recognize or symbolically recognize the nationhood of a community within the state. But again, that's something that's politically difficult to do. The state can also engage in practices of power sharing or consociational democracy. I think you'll hear a little bit more about that later on in the webinar, but essentially, the different groups that make up society can decide to govern together in a way that doesn't allow the majority group to exercise really its dominant demographic weight. And finally, the state can decide to grant territorial autonomy to minority communities, at least the most significant ones. And as a couple of authors on federalism, and that usually involves federalism. Federalism is all about, self-rule in conjunction with shared rule, of course, but the self-rule element is really important. And as some authors specialized in federalism have said, it's really that promise of autonomy that has brought federalism to the forefront of conflict management around the world, right? So what is the theory of federalism for managing territorial diversity? Why is it that scholars like me think that, states, countries that are territorially diverse can or could, in a liberal democratic context, gain from federalism? The first reason is that, as I just said, autonomy is typically what these territorially concentrated minorities want. Minorities that have a homeland, they want the opportunity and the capacity to be able to decide some elements of what they consider their own affairs, right? So autonomy is, the state, by considering federalism, entertains typically claims of these minority communities. Another argument in favor of federalism, if you will, is that autonomy results presumably in a sense of security, physical security, but also cultural security, security in terms of identity, perhaps even in terms of economics. And in turn, that sense of security may favor an acceptance, maybe some enthusiasm even, towards the state and its citizenship. Another reason to think about federalism in the context of liberal democratic territorial diversity is that by decentralizing political power and policy-making responsibilities in areas that are often really sensitive in diverse countries, like language, like culture, like education, you remove potential sources of conflict between groups, right? you eliminate some potential sources of conflict. Now, scholars of federalism are also well aware that there's a little bit of a paradox to federalism. Federalism provides autonomy to minority communities. It gives them political institutions, their own political class. So it gives them tools that can be used for their protection, again, cultural, socio-economic, linguistic. But at the same time, of course, these institutions can be used to put forward claims towards the state, including self-determination claims. Perhaps some communities will want, more autonomy than what they have. Perhaps they'll want a different relationship with the state, right? That's, the so-called paradox of federalism. It's part and parcel of liberal democracy, freedom of expression, right? Now, one question that scholars of federalism have asked for a long time is, how much does a society need to be federal before a state is federal? Because there's some important principles behind federalism. One is partnership. Federalism is a partnership between different communities who willingly want to be part of the same state. These communities recognize each other as partners, right? They reciprocate in their treatment of one another. Federalism also involves this notion that, these partners will have governments, right? They'll have political institutions, which are not either superior or inferior to the central level of government. So this kind of idea of non-hierarchy. And again, at the end of the day, there's also the notion of self-determination that's inherent to federalism. A community is part of a state because it wants to be, because it decides to be. And that communities have an opportunity to make their own decisions about their political future. Now, as someone who's been giving these types of talks for well over 20 years now to different political actors in different parts of the world, I know very well that federalism can be scary, especially from the perspective of the majority group, right? Who often see it as a potential weakness, which I've often wondered about, because you have a lot of very successful, if not powerful, countries that are federations, but there is this view that federalism, because it involves this division of powers, may trigger weakness, may expose states to disintegration, may represent a slippery slope towards secession. And while, the principle of self-determination does come with federalism, we have yet to have a secession from a liberal democratic federation. It's never happened. So these fears, to me, are exaggerated. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about, for maybe my last 5-10 minutes, some of the nuts and bolts of federalism and some of the challenges in thinking about a federal system in the context of a state like Iran that's always been unitary and centralized in nature, right? When you look to transition towards federalism, the first question is, who are going to be these constituent units? In Canada, where I'm sitting here, we have 10 provinces, right? The United States has 50 states. And in a new federal system, the question is, who and where who will be the constituent units, the units that will make up the federation, that will be the partners of this federation? Where will they be territorially? How many will there be? And sometimes it's even controversial, how will they be named, right? Because members of a minority group often want, the constituent unit, the unit where they are, to kind of bear the name of their community, to represent that community from a cultural and identity perspective. So these can be difficult negotiations, of course. And then there is the issue of who will do what. So in a federal system with federalism, you have a central government who does some things, and then governments of these constituent units of the federation who do other things. In Canada, provinces do different things than the federal government. In the United States, state governments do different things than the American federal government. So, and some federations even have a third level of government, which is a municipal level. So there needs to be an organization of the division of powers. Then you need to decide what will be the fiscal arrangement. So these constituent units, will they have power to levy their own taxes, income tax, corporate tax, and so on and so forth, right? Who collects revenues from natural resources? Always a really tricky issue in the context of states rich with natural resources like Iran, right? Typically, the federal government will own the natural resources and collect its revenues, and then can decide how to redistribute these revenues. But it need not be like this. Again, in Canada, where I'm sitting here, Canadian provinces, not the federal government, own the natural resources and collect the revenues that stem from their exploitation, right? And then most federal systems, from an economic perspective, implement what we call equalization programs. When you decentralize political power, you run the risk of having some region be, because they're wealthier than others, be able to provide services of a greater quality, right? So most federations, to counter this potential pitfalls, redistribute money so that all the constituent units of the federation have about the same fiscal capacity, the same capacity to implement whatever programs they want in their sphere of jurisdiction, of course, but to have the revenues to implement the programs in a way that will be about even across the country. Federalism typically also involves a representation of these partners, these constituent units, in an upper house, right? So usually federations are bicameral at their center. They have a lower house, which represents the country as a whole, and then they have an upper house, which provides representation for the different communities, the different partners, the different constituent units of the federation. So that's also something to think about when thinking about federalism. And finally, although federalism involves this division of power between levels of government, in contemporary policy making, things tend to be interlinked, right? So of course, power over natural resources is often linked to economic development, is linked to environmental policies, linked to many different things. So as a result, in all federations, there are mechanisms, forums for governments of different levels to come together, share information, share experiences, sometimes coordinate. So there are forums for intergovernmental relations. So I'll leave you with just a couple of concluding thoughts. Again, one of the questions that federalism scholars grapple with a lot is, can you have federalism in any society, right? Even societies that do not have a history of it, where the concept might not be overly familiar, where the culture is more towards, first of all, an authoritarian state, and a state that is unitary, very centralized. How does a transition towards federalism occur in contexts like these? And perhaps during the Q&A, I'd like to maybe hear your thoughts about, the potential, but also the obstacles for federalism in Iran. So I think I will stop here.
Thank you, Andre. That was a very good learning experience, at least for myself. We have a couple of questions in the QA chat. Because of timing, we would continue with the next presentation. Please, I encourage everyone to type in your questions. I'm just going to say this really quick in Farsi as well. هموطنان دوستان عزیزی که سوالاتتون رو به فارسی میل دارید پرسیده بشه، سوالتون رو به فارسی بنویسید و من به انگلیسی از پنلیستا خواهم پرسید. متشکرم. And with this, let's continue with our next presenter here, Professor Alison McCullough. Alison McCullough is the author of the book Power Sharing and Political Stability in Deeply Divided Societies. She's also the co-editor of several volumes on power sharing arrangements, including Power Sharing Empirical and Normative Challenges, and Power Sharing Pact and the Woman, Peace, and Security Agenda. Her research considers the interplay between adaptability, functionality, and adaptability in the life cycle of power sharing agreements. She is particularly interested in the dynamics of inclusion and exclusion intrinsic to power sharing practice, and how such arrangements can be made more inclusive of identities beyond the ethno-national divide. Now, when Alison isn't writing books and essays or is not actively participating in public discussions like this one, she teaches at Brandon University, Manitoba, where she is chair and professor of political science. Alison, thank you very much for accepting our invite. The floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ali. I'll share my screen as well here. And hopefully we can all see that. Great. Again, thank you for the invitation to be here today. So as just mentioned, my research focuses sort of broadly on politics and ethnically divided societies and on different forms of power sharing, specifically on two different types, what are called consociationalism and centripetalism. And I'm not sure if there are necessarily some easy translations for these terms, so I'll use direct and indirect power sharing to convey the difference between them. So with the time I have, I'd like to discuss these two different types of power sharing models and the political institutions that they recommend, touch on some of the benefits and drawbacks to each, and then add some related remarks on what we might call process design or other points to consider when getting to a new government system. And I'll start by noting that I'm using the term possibilities here in two different ways. First, in the sense of what is potential or what is possible. So power sharing has much to offer to new democracies, especially those that are ethnically diverse. They help to bring minority voices into parliament and into the executive. They help ensure inclusive government. They increase minority access to public resources. And they can help to build trust across ethnic lines, securing commitments to peace and democracy. So power sharing offers the possibility of democracy. But I'm also using possibility in sort of the less certain meaning of the term as something that may or may not yet occur. So like Andre, I am not an expert on Iran or Iranian politics, and I'm not entirely sure what a democratic Iran should or will look like, nor is it perhaps for me to say. But what I can do is tell you a little bit more about some of these different ways by which power can be shared to see if any of it resonates with you. Okay, so what do we mean by power sharing? So this is a way to allocate decision-making rights, including access to public resources, among the different collectivities competing for power. And it's a common form of government found in societies with diversity, ethnic, religious, and or linguistic diversity. And there's a lot of different ways by which power can be shared, but generally we speak of sort of two main types with different logics. The first, consociationalism or direct power sharing, sees the different ethnic, religious, or linguistic communities as the building blocks for the design of political institutions. So its purpose is to put the representatives of these different groups directly into government, to give ethnic groups not only their own share of power, but also some degree of shared rule. So it's closely related to federalism, as just discussed by Andre. The idea is that ethnic groups or linguistic or religious groups should be empowered to speak for themselves and to represent their own interests. So you make joint decisions in areas of common concern with other groups, and you have sole decision-making authority in areas of your own concern. The other type of power sharing, centripetalism or indirect power sharing, is about making ethnic representatives reciprocally dependent on one another for votes. So the idea, and it's sort of drawn from physics, though I'm not a physicist, is that to resist the sort of centrifugal forces of a divided society, which is pushing parties sort of towards the outer spectrums of the system and away from one another, institutions should offer incentives to pull them towards the center or the moderate middle. So this is done by encouraging groups to work together, either in standalone multi-ethnic parties or in pre-election coalition agreements. So the system is designed to reward ethnic moderation, the assumption being that moderates will be more likely to work together than hardliners. So the institutional prescriptions of the two different power sharing models vary, but the one point that binds them together is an underlying commitment to the belief that political institutions can offer creative solutions to our political and social problems, including ethnic divisions. So it's sort of both agree that you can design democracy, or it's possible. Okay, so how might we turn these logics of building blocks on the one hand and centripetal forces on the other into systems of governance? And I'll start with direct power sharing. And there are four key aspects here. The first is a government by grand coalition. So meaning that the government at the center has representatives from all the major groups in society working together. And this can take different forms. The most common is a parliamentary system with a coalition government, but it could also include having a collective presidency where you have presidents from different communities in a sort of presidential council. It might be a president with a strong vice president coming from different groups. Or you might reserve the top posts like a presidency, a prime minister, and speaker for representatives of different groups. The second feature is proportionality. So proportionality rules for the legislature can be achieved through the adoption of a list proportional representation electoral system. So in a list PR system, The percentage of the vote you receive is equivalent to the number of seats you get. So if you get 20% of the vote, then you would get 20% of the seats. Proportionality can also be implemented through reserved seats, through ethnic quotas, or affirmative action programs, also in the civil service, in the security sector, and other parts of state power. It is also used as a principle for resource allocation and other budgetary decisions. The third is group autonomy. And again, this is where we have some parallels with federalism. And indeed, some consociational systems are also federal systems as well. The key being that the different groups have their own federal units in this model. Where groups might live territorially dispersed, you can have cultural autonomy provisions, where each group would have autonomy over important issues related to identity, such as schooling or language education or museums and other cultural sites, perhaps even its own legal codes. So again, that can be a useful strategy if a group is territorially dispersed, and it would be hard to give them their own federal unit. And then finally, you have veto rights. Here, all groups, regardless of whether they're majority or minority, would have the right to veto legislation if it can be shown to be harmful to their vital interests. So the majority, for example, couldn't move to terminate minority language education because the minority could vote to stop this from moving forward. There are different ways to implement these kinds of veto rights. So you could have a minority group caucus that would oppose the motion. You could have qualified majority voting rules that would require mutual consent of all of the groups for a piece of legislation to move forward. Or you could have quorum stipulations. An important point to note here is that all four of these different kinds of institutions can be designed by either predetermining which groups get what, so by reserving seats or having ethnic quotas determined in advance of elections, or you can allow groups to self-determine the extent of their own involvement via the outcome of democratic elections. So take something like a grand coalition government. In a predetermined arrangement, you would reserve seats for specific groups, right? You would again know in advance who would fill what post. In a self-determination model, you would let those elections determine the extent of representation. So one way to create a grand coalition this way would be to say that any group that receives, say, 10% of the vote in the legislature would then be permitted to join the cabinet. You wouldn't name the group in advance, but you would be able to ensure that groups that have societal support are able to gain cabinet access. So most academics will tell you that self-determination is the best option. It's more democratic, it's more flexible, it's more adaptive to societal circumstances over time. Politicians might tell you that predetermination is the better option, helping to lock in a share of power. And again, there's quite a bit of debate between these two different types. So this kind of direct power sharing is useful where there are, as one leading scholar puts it, more than one people with reasonable claims. That is, you have a state where you have well-defined communities who each merit political power. It is also useful where there is a lack of trust between majorities and minorities due to histories of violence or oppression. It is, again, also useful where you might have a group that risks being locked out of power based on their size alone. So you want to make sure that they can still access political power, even if they're quite small. This kind of system generally works well when you have maybe 3 or 5 groups of roughly the same size, but that's not determinative. It's been used in all kinds of different demographic configurations. But it does mean that what society looks like will be an important consideration for how to organize each of these institutions. It also doesn't come without risks. Decision-making can be slow, sometimes even immobile, with so many different group interests around the table. Vetoes, if not designed carefully, can create impasses if they're used frequently. This can also make it a system that is hard to reform because it needs everybody to agree on the new set of rules. It can also risk entrenching ethnic divisions rather than alleviating them as intended by encouraging parties to try to outbid one another or to see everything through their own group perspective alone. And again, there was a big academic debate on this, and there's evidence for both the alleviation and the entrenchment of divisions. And then finally, it can also be difficult to convince majority groups to share power because they are often able to govern alone. Minority groups tend to see this system more favorably because it gives them a direct seat at the table, as well as the resources to chart their own path, which is also why majorities may not be so keen on it. So what about centripetalism or indirect power sharing? So this approach was developed as a response to the concerns that direct power sharing would make divisions more entrenched. It calls for that reciprocal dependence of ethnic groups via institutions that reward ethnic moderation. So one of the first ways you can do so is with an electoral system called the alternative vote. So this is where elections take place in a majoritarian single district system. So a party to win a seat needs to get an absolute majority, or 50% plus one. It also requires a preferential ballot, meaning that you rank order all of the candidates, so your first, second, third, fourth preference, and so on. If no majority is achieved, you eliminate the lowest performing candidate, you redistribute their second order preferences until you get to that majority. The logic here is that to win, whether on first or second or third preferences, you need to reach out to groups other than your own. The only way they will vote for you is if you appear to be reasonable or moderate to their interests. It also recommends a presidential system in which the winning candidate must draw support from across the whole country in order to get elected. So for example, to become president, you would need, as in one case, at least 25% of the vote in about 2/3 of all of the federal units. So the idea being here is that, again, you would be drawing your support from across the country as a whole, as well as from those different groups in society. This system also recommends federalism, but not for the same reason or in the same way as direct power sharing. Here, you would design federal units in such a way as to cut across group lines, thereby reducing that ability to secede or become independent. So on one hand, again, a fairly attractive option if election is only possible by appealing to lower order preferences, then politicians will likely present themselves as moderate and cooperative, particularly on ethnically contentious issues. But there are risks here too. First, it doesn't guarantee minorities a share of power. What it offers is the ability to influence majority decision-making. So there's a built-in advantage for parties that represent the majority, given that they have to pool fewer votes in order to win office than do politicians from smaller groups. And that's why we're better off thinking about it as indirect power sharing, right? So you might have ethnic minorities in government, but it might just be that that the minorities' preferences help someone else win. So minorities, again, might find it difficult to elect their own representatives, even moderate ones, and again, hope that those lower order preferences induce majority parties to treat them favorably. That those parties will do so is far from guaranteed. So it can be hard to trust other parties or even be willing to vote for the other side, even with your lower order preferences. So if direct power sharing or consociationalism is more popular with minorities than majorities, here we have the flip side to this. It's more likely to be preferred by larger groups and less likely to be accepted by minorities. So partly here, it's about how you are voting in elections, right? That you can rank the candidates according to who you like most, who you like least, and that parties would cooperate with each other to try to get votes from the different groups. So what might we make of all of this? First, it's important to note that there is no single one way to share power. You have to find the system that works best for the conditions in the country in question. So context really does matter. So this includes taking account of a country's demographic profile. So the size of the different groups, the number of them, their territorial distribution, as well as any cross-border connections they have will all matter. It's also important to keep in mind the depth of divisions, particularly if these have manifested violently in recent history. Also important to keep in mind previous treatment of minorities as well as any history of democracy. Second, both of these different kinds of power sharing rely on elites to cooperate, but it's also worth finding ways for meaningful citizen inclusion during political transitions. So democratic arrangements that link social and elite inclusion are more resilient and adaptable over time than are those that only focus on the elite level. So it's important to find ways for citizen participation in the political transition, whether through citizens' assemblies or other kinds of spaces for deliberation or in referendums and so on. So it's important that citizens see themselves in the creation of democratic institutions and feel like their voices matter in the process. Third, and in keeping with the theme of inclusion, it's also important not to forget what we call the others. By this, I mean those groups that aren't directly included in the power sharing arrangement. That might mean very small or territorially dispersed ethnic groups. It might mean women or other gender minorities. It might mean civic or non-ethnic parties. So both forms of power sharing are highly focused on ethnic diversity and accommodating different ethnic communities. But other identities matter too. And so we don't want to reduce the diversity of a diverse society to only one issue or one part of our identity, right? Because this misses how we organize and make meaning in our lives. So as a leading scholar argues, quote, "Nowhere is politics simply reducible to the common denominator of ethnic ties. There are also other issues." So again, gender might be one, age might be another one. So finding ways, particularly to include youth in politics would be important. There are rural and urban divides and sort of different ideological or class-based considerations as well. So we all have nested identities. So even when we design institutions with ethnic groups in mind, this shouldn't preclude bringing in these other aspects like gender or disability or ideology or class into the design process. And it's important to recall that those choices on institutions, again, by including some or recognizing some kinds of diversity, we risk the exclusion of others. And that these more marginalized groups might bear the brunt of the trade-offs in these institutional questions. So it's important to think of the implications for them along the way as well. So it might include introducing gender quotas alongside ethnic quotas, or reserving seats for very small groups, or other ways to make sure that government looks like the society that it's meant to represent. So all political systems have their benefits and drawbacks. all institutional design choices will contain trade-offs, and there's no perfect set of institutions, no magic formula for a fully inclusive political system. But what's important when embarking on a democratic transition is to find institutional and political channels that facilitate opportunities for political issues to be peacefully, democratically, and jointly addressed. So power sharing, whether it's direct or indirect, offers the possibilities for this to happen, providing incentives for and the framework within political actors can work together for the benefit of all citizens. And then again, whether that is possible is then up to the actors themselves. So perhaps I will end it there for now. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alison. That was really informative. I learned a lot, and I'm sure that the audience is with me on that. We are receiving a good amount of questionnaire here in the chat, and I'm trying to organize them as much as I can. Obviously, I have my own questions as well, but we will continue the Q&A in the chat. I'd appreciate if Alison, yourself, and Andre, if you can look at the questions raised in the Q&A. If you prefer to answer them directly there, you can, and Abbas yourself as well. But because you will be presenting right after, I'm organizing them. So with this, let's move to our third, last but not least, panelist here, Professor Abbas Wali. Abbas Wali is the rector of the University of Kurdistan, Howler. He is a political theorist and a specialist in the politics of the modern Middle East. Professor Wali taught at the University of Wales, Swansea in the UK from 1985 to 2004, and at Bogazici University in Istanbul from 2008 to 2018. He has written and published extensively on the aspects of modern Middle East history and politics, especially on Iranian history and politics and the Kurdish question in the Middle East. Thank you very much, Professor Wali. With this, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Just one correction. I'm no longer rector of University of Kurdistan in Erbil. That was in 2005 to 2008. Thank you. I am going to talk about the problem of decentralization from or decentralized rule from a quite a different angle. I'm going to talk about it in the context of the present day Iran, exactly present day Iran, and now, and just now, what is going on in Iran. And that makes the case rather concrete, historical, political in that respect, contemporary history, present history. And I'm going to look at some of my, if you like, arguments in the light of, what actually my two colleagues just said in their presentations, that how some of the arguments actually fare in a context of society like Iran or a country like Iran. We all know that Iran is undergoing a political upheaval, an uprising, and some call it a revolution, starting in September 16, 2022. It is now on a low ebb, but by no means a dead and out. And this development, which has been unique in its character and nature, as in a sense that because the Islamic regime in Iran has failed to contain it effectively, let alone actually stop it. So, or rather suppress it. So we are talking about an ongoing situation. And this development, this uprising, this revolution has prompted the Iranian opposition to look for alternatives to the Islamic regime. And these alternatives have been formulated, they have been shunted about, and they are very diverse and very different in form and character, showing the political, if you like, convictions and ideological coloring of these various, if you like, groupings or various forces in the opposition. These alternatives, which are being talked about, they are in declarations, and these declarations are coming out every day almost. And that makes the case very interesting, but also at the same time rather difficult to talk about it in any precise way. Now, the Iranian opposition is very diverse. So when I am saying the Iranian opposition, I am basically using this term in order to talk about a variety of groups, political parties, organizations who define themselves in opposition to the Islamic regime. And these diverse, but despite this diversity, the Iranian opposition share some common grounds which would enable us to talk about them in a more systematic way. First is that almost every single one of these political groupings, political organizations, and even individuals believe in secular political rule. Do you have my picture?
We do have your video activated and also your voice clearly.
Right. So they are all believers in secular political system. Second, decentralized rule and democratic political process. Insofar as secularism is concerned, they are fairly clear about it. But when we come to democratic political system, it's terribly vague because they have a very simplistic and at times quite archaic views of democracy, which cannot respond to one of the major, if you like, slogans of this revolution, which it demanded radical pluralist democracy. And then we have the idea of decentralized rule. On the idea of decentralized rule, they're also quite vague. The Kurdish political opposition specifically argue for federalism. And it is also the case with the Baluchis and with the Arabs in Iran. They are arguing for a kind of federalism, which its nature has not been actually, its character has not been specified as such. But none Kurdish and non-ethnic, so to speak, political groupings, mostly Persian, are extremely vague as to what this decentralized rule means. My argument is this, that this notion of decentralized rule cannot be in any way sustained in the discourse of Iranian opposition if they do not also at the same time believe in democratic pluralism. Because the absence of a radical conception of citizenship undermines the linkage between decentralized government and a democratic political process. And this is exactly what they do not want to pay attention to. The angle from which the non-ethnic, I am using, sort of in a centrist, that is Persian speaking, and those who are committed to a unitary state, to a homogeneous society, and also a single political rule, not divided in any way, linguistically, and ethnically, and even, if you like, in terms of gender and sexuality, which they cannot, if you like, provide for it in that respect. Now, the most important thing about them is that they look at the situation from a very nationalist angle. And we all know that when you look at it from a nationalist standpoint, you talk about it in the context of a nation state. And in the context of the nation state, nationality and citizenship always are equal. And in that respect, in the context of a nation state, when there is only one single nation and no democratic diversity has been taken into consideration, what we have here is that every person in the country, every Iranian national is at the same time also a citizen. But when we look at this idea that Iran actually is not a single nation, there is diversity, is a multinational state, and that if these identities are not considered, therefore the idea of democratic pluralism cannot be held. And if they are considered, then this equation inside the nation state, which citizenship and nationality are equal, cannot be sustained. And if cannot be sustained, therefore, what is going to happen? What we have here now. Let us assume that the Islamic regime is out, and the opposition is back, and there is a constituent, there is a referendum, there is a constituent assembly, and the constituent assembly is looking at the question of democracy, the question of power, distribution of power, national identity, citizenship, and so on and so forth. Here, if we go by the idea that Iranian opposition, that is the centrist opposition, is forcing, we are going to have a situation in which simply no improvement to the current situation that we have in Islamic Republic can be foreseen. Simply no improvement in that respect. And I am talking about it in this way, that if we look at the idea of nation state, and in the Constitution, we know that the sovereign and the identity of sovereign is a consequence of the founding act of the state. And the founding act of the state also at the same time defines the structure of domination. And this structure of domination in a single nation state always means the suppression of non-sovereign identities. Either these identities are entirely suppressed or they are partially recognized, like it is in the Constitution of the Islamic Republic. So if we are going to say that the Kurds and Baluchis and the Arabs and Turkmens and Azeris are simply ethnic minorities, that means that we have given them only a partial recognition. This partial recognition is a very tricky notion. And this partial recognition is expressed in the constitution of the state in the concept of ethnic minority or local minority. Partial recognition or ethnic minority is a mechanism of othering, but I am not going into that detail now. What I am talking about here is that if we go with the idea of ethnic minority and partial recognition, then we are actually coming to a situation which is already present in a certain way, but probably 1 degree better in the Constitution. And that would be this, that we will have legal recognition of the Kurds, Baluchis, the Arabs, the Turkmens, the Azeris, but at the expense of their political exclusion, their exclusion from political process. And here, what is very crucial in this respect is the concept of citizenship. The definition, if the definition of national identity in the constitution of the state, which is the document of the founding document of the state, if the concept of national identity is what the Persian-speaking opposition is arguing for, that is Persian ethnicity, Persian language, and Persian culture, history, and all of it, then we are in a situation where the definition, its consequences for the definition of citizenship in the document of the Constitution would be absolutely destructive. In a sense, because all those whose identity does not conform with the definition of national identity in the Constitution, which is codified to say that the official language is Persian, the state is, identity is Iranian in that respect. All in all, the document will become a, if you like, means of linking the dominant ethnicity with political power at the expense of the others. And here, the definition of national identity will mean that if those whose identity do not conform with it, simply will be falling outside the law. And they cannot in any effective way considered as citizens, democratic citizens. And this is a problem which is not being considered. And this is a problem that the Kurdish opposition and others do not put forward from now on, that what kind of citizen are we talking about? What kind of democracy are we talking about? What kind of national identity are we talking about? Because these are all hidden under these conceptions of decentralized rule and democratic political process. Insofar as there is this situation which I call it the democratic deficit. Democratic deficit. It's a shortcoming. It's a shortcoming in a sense, between what is, if you like, citizenship and what is national identity, what is partial recognition, and what is the concept of ethnic minority. Insofar as there is this democratic deficit, there cannot be any conception of democratic citizenship in Iran. And if there is no conception of democratic citizenship, the necessary, absolutely vital link between the form of distribution of power, decentralization, be it federalism or anything, and the democratic political process will be ruptured. And this rupture means that no matter how much we talk about federalism, how much we talk about decentralization, we simply be unable to implement or sustain it. What is important here is that right from now, these issues, particularly the issue of national identity, the issue of democratic pluralism, radical democratic pluralism, and also the notion of a democratic citizenship should be, in a sense, put into these declarations, and members of the various political groupings must really sit and discuss them before they are ever in a situation to go into the Constituent Assembly and discuss the character of the forthcoming, if you like, constitution. Constitution is the founding document of the state. What goes in it is very important. It is quite true that in every constitution, we will be talking about single notion of sovereignty. But it is also true that we can extend this sovereignty to multiple nationalities. The notion of nationality, which is excluded from the discussion of a large part of the opposition, and is not considered in, if you like, various discussions which are right now going on in Canada. It is very important, if you like, if we come to this point, that what do we actually mean by this nation? What do you actually mean by the notion of a national minority? And what does this partial recognition of more than half of the Iranian population would mean or for the democratic political process? In this respect, therefore, discussions of federalism, what federalism should look like in Iran, or what this decentralization should look like in Iran, I think is going to be basically a marginal issue. What is very important is that what basically the character of the Iranian people, their diversity, is going to be accounted for in the legal and political process. And for this, I have argued for the exclusion of this idea of national minority. National minority, from my point of view, in a country like Iran, in the context of present struggles which are going on in Iran, is simply a mechanism for exclusion by inclusion. It is inclusion legally and exclusion politically. An identity which would be denied politically, an identity which, if the political process defined in the context of the Constitution, then that means that all those whose identity is not going to conform with this definition of national identity are going to fall outside the legal process. If you like, the legal definition of political process, which means that they would be automatically target for state violence, because as it has been for the past 80 years or 85 years in Iran, those whose identity falls outside the constitutional definition of what political process is, what the boundaries of political process is, or are, boundaries of political process are, and how they are decided. They fall in a murky, if you like, sphere, space, the gray zone, the zone of indistinction between law and violence, where even law has a fundamentally violent profile. In this respect, therefore, we are now in the beginning. I have been arguing and I have been, writing about this issue, that why at present issues such as citizenship, such as national minority, such as nationality, multinational state, and above all, national identity, in a country like Iran, which is undergoing a very important democratic upheaval, the outcome of which may be something which is absolutely unique in the contemporary history. It is the revolution of woman life and freedom. It is a revolution which has been able to gather diverse identities, diverse ethnicities, diverse sexualities, diverse religions, diverse cultures under this slogan, and create for the first time in Iranian history a real, true political process marked by democratic diversity. And what is more, it's a political process in which women and the young are pioneers of change. Now, if these are not reflected in the political arrangements that are now being discussed by different aspects of this, different forces in the opposition, then we are going to be, if you like, truly in a difficult situation. We will be in a situation of made great sacrifices, but for little achievement. So some would think that my arguments are simply tired theoretical arguments. They are not. They are theoretical arguments with specific and for insofar as Iranian case is concerned, essential and vital political consequences. And I hope that discussions like this are going to be more, they're going to be proliferate, and more people will be talking about dangers of the situation right now, when the opposition is prompted by the change, encouraged by the change, and are working out the nature of the, or the character of the alternative to come. We don't want notions of ethnic minority. We don't want partial recognitions. And we do not want mechanisms of exclusion by inclusion. What we want is a democratic citizenship, and what we want is a notion of national identity, which is de-ethnified, which is not religious, and which is not, in a sense, culturally conditioned in any way. This is the argument that I am putting forward, without which I think no amount of discussion about federalism, about decentralization will not get anywhere, simply because the linkage between federalism, form of distribution of power, and the form of exercise of power in the political process will be interrupted. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Wali. There's a lot to handle myself. These are lots and lots of ideas and things that you brought up to the table. They beg for deep thinking at the part of Iranians as a nation. We obviously have our differences like anybody else does, and we can see that in the Q&A in the chat. This is astonishing. We still have 11 open discussions in the Q&A. I can see that the panelists are busy addressing and answering the questions in the chat, which is really appreciated. With this, let's go to the participants who have their hands up. I can see a few hands, but before going to the participants for the oral questions, my question to Ibrahim is that as we agreed, we go first by the participants who want to ask their questions directly, and then we go to the other questions, right?
Absolutely. And I will kindly ask all panelists to turn on the camera if it's possible, because we don't know who will be asked directly. And I think the first question is coming from Yashar. I will add them one by one, and then I will remove them from the panelist. Okay.
Ibrahim, while at it, can we change the view to a panel view so we can see all the panelists, please?
Absolutely, I will do that. You should be able to see right now.
Sorry, I cannot open my video. I don't know, it's saying like that you cannot start the video because the host has stopped it. But like I'm asking my question from Professor Andre. Well, your colleague, Professor Will Kimlicka, is like arguing like in the previous his book about the federalism in Middle East and Iran. He's arguing that like the federalism in Middle East is it's hard, it's like the kind of impossible, because like the nature of the governments over there, they are like they're seeing the ethnic minorities or like the nations that like in case of Iran, which is multinational, they see these nations as a threat to their national security. I'm just wondering, what's your take on it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree that that's the perception. Listen, federalism is hard to promote in most parts of the world, as I kind of indicated in my talk, especially in contexts that have a long history of authoritarianism, of control of the state by one group, a majority, typically a demographically dominant group, but sometimes not, sometimes like, kind of a hegemonic minority. The idea of dividing power, the idea of having autonomy, the idea of recognizing different internal communities, all of that is very scary, very destabilizing, and of course threatens the power of the majority group. So I completely agree with all of that it's really, really difficult. So, typically the possibility of federalism really hinges on and I think maybe it's probably the same when it comes to power sharing, hinges on decisions made by the representatives of the majority group, right? So in the case of Iran, would the Persian majority be willing to entertain federalism, right? I mean, that's really how these things tend to be played. In some circumstances, in most circumstances, I'm in Ottawa, I'm in the capital here, so I give a lot of talk to foreign delegations, including from states that are or have been authoritarian, and I quickly get the sense, if kind of federalism is really an option in the minds of these elites of the majority group. So maybe it'll be up for you guys to tell me if you think that the Persian majority in Iran would consider something like federalism. Of course, it's not surprising that the Kurds and other minorities would want federalism. We expect that, right? But federalism is not something that can be imposed, right? Certainly not by minorities. They'll be wanted by minorities, but at the end of the day, of course, I think the majority group will weigh heavily on the prospects of federalism in Iran.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. And just a very short comment, complement to your explanation, is that there is a fundamental difference between Middle East and the established democracies that we have right now in the world, and that's from the historical geopolitical point of view, especially when it comes to Iran and its history and all the governance models that it experienced throughout the history, is quite something, and maybe begs another whole session to just look at all the different trial and error governance models in the history of Iran. Recently, I came across a small piece of literature that indeed Iran also experienced communism before the Karl Marx essays. So anyways,
Ali, if I may, I just want to add one thing, maybe to give some hope, right? I did spend 3 years of my life working on the federalization of Nepal, which is a small country, which was out of a civil war, with no history of democracy, no history of federalism, actually a history and a culture of centralized unitary state dominated by one privileged group, which used the state to oppress a whole bunch of minorities. It's an extremely poor country in a very difficult geopolitical situation sandwiched between Iran and China. And the federalization has not been easy and is not complete, but I would deem it quite successful. So there are possibilities for federalism, even in less than ideal circumstances. I just want to add that.
Thank you very much. I can see Jafar, the Professor Sheikh al-Islami, you have your hand up, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt because I know the sequences. So first is Sahar, then Homayun, then Professor Sheikh al-Islami, and finally will be Sirwan. My apologies.
Hi, thank you so much. Can I ask my question? Yeah, okay.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. First of all, it was a very much needed topic actually, especially federalism, because despite of the lack of the knowledge, and beside the lack of knowledge, there is a huge campaign by the intelligence service of Iran that has equaled the federalism as to separation. So that, I mean, it's even difficult to make an argument because immediately you are labeled. So this is one major issue. But actually, I did a study in 19 different states of the federal, and I compared, because I made a list of all the critiques that they are making against the federalism, and I went to find the answer against it. I believe that the federalism is a very good system, especially for the multi-ethnicity country like Iran, and because there is so much of the mafia, which is basically the government is the mafia based. So this is one of the way that you can control the shaping again the mafias. I mean, this is my stance. I just wanted, but I found it a bit difficult in Iran to do it ethnicity-based federalism, because it's such a mix-up in some areas. For instance, we have an oil province which has 9 different ethnicities. We have the Azerbaijan Gharbi, which has 4 different ethnicities, Khorasan 4, Baluchistan 4, the Tehran and the Alborz, which is the central, they are all the 10 of the ethnicities. So basically, it looks like that it's supposedly in the best case scenario should be the geographical, but there could be some alliance between the different provinces based on the nature and the ethnicities and demography or whatever. This is it. So, and the other things, and then I wanted to mention something. Basically, I don't know how you calculate the majority and minority. If we consider a population is considered majority, if they are over the 50% of the population, then we don't have any majority in Iran. Basically, none of the ethnicities, including the Farsis, they are above the 50%. Is it the case, Dr. Andre? Wait, as a definition. I have another question for Alison, but I will make it quick.
Oh, I mean, when I use majority, I use majority groups. So I really mean the biggest group, right? So I understand that there's no clear 50% plus 1 majority in Iran, but there's of course a group that historically has had power and you know, which, you know, probably has some kind of coherence, and it will be, I think, the position of this group which will determine the extent to which federalism can be entertained. And what you said about the agents of the state, if you will, equating federalism with disintegration, with secession and all of that, that's par for the course. That's always. And it's a challenge, you're right, to mount a different discourse, but there is a different discourse. And I think, you know, there's about 25 federations around the world, right? And as I said, in no liberal democratic federation has there ever been a secession. It hasn't happened. And, you know, a lot of these federations, they're prosperous, they're liberal democratic, some of them are really powerful, right? So there's really no evidence that federalism triggers disintegration. What it does trigger is negotiations, discussions, dialogue, all these things that a lot of politicians don't want, right? It's often easier to just wield political power when you're used to doing that rather than have to negotiate your way through it, right?
Yeah, I apologize, Doctor. I read just now, if I knew, I would make only one, but I will make it very quick. And I read in the narrow corridor of the Robinson and the Ajamoglu. I mean, it actually strikes me a lot. There was a session about how it went in the Athens, the system that they actually empower the citizen, every citizen individually, and they created the citizen assembly. But one we have now, I mean, like that was a very great idea to me, because I think some people, they might find themselves any parties as their own representatives, so they want to come in forward. But in yesterday in Toronto conference, I was a bit surprised, because there was two members of the one Kurdish political party that they were insisting that any coalition should be only by the representative of the parties, and it shouldn't be by any individual, even if they are influencer. Because currently we have a group of the influencer that, let's say they are artists or athletes, but they have a lots of followers, and basically we haven't heard anything wrong from them that we can disqualify them based on their political knowledge. And I found it a bit challenging for our future, because if we want to make any citizen empowered to contribute in their own right, then we cannot make such an exclusion criteria to see that if you're not belonging to any party, you should not come in. How do you see this? I mean, I think from what I heard from you and what I read in the book, it's what I'm saying making sense. And that exclusion criteria doesn't make sense. And I even gave an example that even Amina Kakababa, a Kurdish parliamentarian in the current Swedish parliament, has entered the Swedish parliament as an independent, and she's not representing any parties, and she made a coalition with many other parties.
Who are you asking that question?
I could ask you basically maybe you, Dr. Abbas, I mean, because I heard from the Alison also. How do you see this? I mean, because that's a challenge now, because that has been actually impeding the creation of a coalition now in Iran among the opposition.
I don't think that is impeding the formation of a coalition. They are opposed to the idea of, in the coalition, of course, there will be distribution of responsibilities, there will be variety of issues discussed. To put a political party on a par with an individual in that context would be very difficult. And not that I am in agreement with what they are saying, but I'm basically saying that why they are arguing in that way. In fact, this was first put forward by the monarchist opposition. They said that individuals and this is a coalition of individuals, and political parties are not, here. And then I actually, in a television program, I argued against it, that you cannot in large society have talk about democracy without institutions of representation. This is an absurd argument. But the idea is this, that whether those celebrities who have joined here, these so-called, this is not, they all say this is not a coalition. They all argue that this is not a coalition. And they have joined this group who have signed this declaration. Whether they really, are the same as a political party which has been fighting for 80 years, or so on and so forth. I mean, these are questions which can be raised and answered in the context of those things. But not that I'm saying that individuals should not have the right, but I'm saying that these issues are raised when first, as I said, the royalists actually raised this issue when they were not very, if you like, confident about their own following. And it was only after that, program and that discussion about the necessity of institutions of political representation in large societies. I mean, if we say that, no direct democracy is a mechanism of small numbers. I mean, you can't have it in, I'm not, I'm repeating basically Max Weber here. This is it. You have, after that discussion that, the Constitutionalist Party was formed. And that Constitutional Party is clearly a royalist party and claiming, representation. That's all very well. I mean, in democratic political process, that's all their right to do so. But the idea is that it's not the Kurdish, just Kurds, insist on that. And also, the Kurds are not in that respect, one single voice. I mean, one Kurdish political party, which is the Komala. Komala is part of the so-called, the let's say coalition or the grouping. The other one, which is the Kurdish Democratic Party of Iran, is insisting that individuals and political parties and organizations should not be given the same weighting. This is their argument. This is their position. But if you talk about democratic rights, in a sense, I would say it is anybody's right to join or not join the coalition.
Yeah, because even if you want the number of the voters, you see that probably some of the individuals have more vote than any other parties. This we have to consider. Either we are sticking to the democracy, or we are trying to take it off and off whenever we want. I mean, we have to be clear.
We don't really know that.
Okay, sorry, I took so much time. I apologize. Thank you.
I really have to.
We don't really know that. We wouldn't know that until situation in Iran changes. Who has?
I sincerely apologize. I sincerely apologize. That was a very interesting discussion for me.
Thank you.
I took advantage. Thank you so much.
Well, Sahar, there's no need to apology. This is very, very interesting. The only reason we have to move on is that we are really short with time. We only have 12 more minutes on the clock, and we have Zanyar and Yasmin with their hands up. So if you don't mind, let's move on to the next next participant with the question. And please
please remove me from the panel, as you agreed before.
Thank you very much.
I will do it with the pleasure.
Okay, Zanyar, if you're ready for your question, please. And if you could please also mark it as a general question for all panelists, or if you want to make it towards any of the panelists in particular, you can do that as well.
So first was Humayun and second was Jafar.
So can I talk?
Yes, please.
Hi, everybody. First of all, I just want to mention, before my questions, I would like to mention something that we don't have minority in Iran. There are several different nations and tribes in Iran. The only common mistakes that we are speaking, most people are speaking Persian language. That could cause so much confusion. That's what I believe. Secondly, I believe that we need some types of decentralization. It is inevitable in Iran right now. But there are many issues that we have to think about it. First of all, the types of federalism or decentralization in Iran could be completely different than United States or North America, because in these countries, many peoples migrated from different countries and they settled over there. While in Iran, during 6,000 years, many people settled in their lands and they speak in their language, they have history, so we can call them nation. And there are some tribes as well. So if we think that in such a case, we're gonna have some types of federalism, could that cause any nationalism or chauvinism in these areas. How could we avoid it? This is the first question. Secondly, I think that the most important income of Iran is coming from oil resources, and it's located in south of Iran. What will happen to natural resources in Iran? That is the second question. And the third, based on what? The modifications of different governments, the boundaries of many tribes or nations has changed. So if you're going to have federalism in Iran or any types of decentralization or self-determination, whatever, what will happen to these boundaries? And could it cause any domestic fight or civil war in this area? These are my questions. Thank you.
Alison, do you want to put you on the spot?
I feel like that might be more a question for Andre, but I think that those are really sort of valid questions about why, in thinking about how to design those federal units, it's so important to think about what, again, the size of groups, their distribution, what that fiscal arrangement will certainly be. But maybe Andre might want to say a little bit more about that.
Andre, please.
Yeah, no, I agree. Those are all important issues. I mean, I think the main overarching thing for me is that you mentioned the word chauvinism, but I think federalism allows for people to have multiple identities, right? And well, for example, I'm a francophone Quebecer. Most of my fellow francophone Quebecers, they identify with Quebec first and foremost. And then they identify with Canada to different degrees, and some not at all. But that's okay, because they're in a federal system and there is that flexibility, right? So I wouldn't say they're chauvinists, they're just, they have a different primary identity. And federalism is all about that. It's about managing societies where citizens will have potentially multiple territorial identities, and they're able to give different value to different identities, right? So federalism does leave room for that. So if somebody wants everybody in Iran to feel Iranian first and foremost and all the time in the same way, then federalism is not for you, for sure. There's more complexity, there's more diversity in kind of the identity makeup that federalism allows. But again, we come back to that in many parts of the world, including in the Middle East. The culture is for one state, one identity, one nation, and so on and so forth. And of course, federalism presents a challenge for that type of thinking.
Abbas, please.
Yes, I agree that we don't have ethnic minorities in Iran, and they should be considered as nations and nationalities. And that will make life much simpler, and a lot of the problems may, disappear. But about the Iranian system you talked about, until very recently, actually until 1905, when the constitutional state appeared in Iran. Until then, Iran was always ruled as a confederal state, always was ruled as a confederal state. Ever since, you may say that ever since that we're talking about the formation of a state in Iran, let's say 2,500 years ago. But the mistake is that this state was never a centralized empire. It was always a confederal empire. And until 1905, You see, they talk about Mamalik Mahruse Iran. They talk about different states inside the empire. It's a confederal. It was a confederal arrangement, and it worked very well in some sort of like a loosely feudal structure. It worked. And about you, I'm surprised you talk about tribes. Tribes as political factor in Iran do not exist anymore. You know, the political organization of tribes were destroyed in 1930s by Reza Shah, and their economic foundation was destroyed by the land reform in 1962. Tribes are simply cultural entities now. They are not political factors. So in that respect, I think they don't come into calculation in this way, unless some, it was some people attributed, tribes or tribalism, to the Kurds, but simply as political factor, they do not exist anymore. Their political organization and economic foundation of their life, which was large land ownership, was destroyed. And as to, avoiding what you call chauvinism and so on, I'm all for it. But you can just go and look at social media and see where this chauvinism is coming from. That is, they're not coming from the Kurds, they're not coming from the Baluchis, they're not coming from the Arabs, they're not coming from, they're coming from the Persians. And I'm very sorry to say that. But the other thing is that about minority, if you combine all the nationalities in Iran, non-Persian speakings would hold majority altogether. But if you comparison of single one by one, clearly Persians would hold majority in that respect. But that is not really the case. And I am not grouping all Persians here. There are quite a significant number of Persians who are very democratically minded and want a democratic solution to this situation. So therefore, it is not a wholesale, sort of concept applied. No, I wouldn't do that. The solution, I would say, I don't know whether it is federalism. What I want to say is that it should be some sort of decentralized arrangement. But this decentralized arrangement, if it is not based on, if it is not founded on a democratic political process, with a democratic notion of citizenship, with a specifically, all-inclusive notion of national identity and so on, then I think this decentralized rule simply will fall. It will not, and we could do that. I mean, that could be done. I mean, just look at Iraq. Iraq has got one sovereign state, but with two nations. It's the Kurds and Arabs, and it's been working. There's a lot of difficulty because after, so they basically mostly inherited from the form of political change and the military invasion and so on and so forth. But it is not an impossibility. It can work, and it can work well. I agree that Iran is much more diverse in terms of nationalities, cultures, and so on and so forth. They are. It is. But, it doesn't mean that similar arrangements, if it is grounded on a democratic foundation with lots of checks and balances and sort of legal arrangements and so on and so forth, it may work. And it may be possible to go that way. But without, to focus on that, without actually trying to do something radical and substantial about the political process, then it will not go very far.
So my apologies to interrupt. There are 2 points. One is Our interpreter should go to work, so he notified me because we just booked these 2 hours. So we don't have interpreter for people that they have limited knowledge of English. Second point, you mentioned Mamalik Mahruse Iran. I just posted, I just shared an image of a stamp which is going back to the time of Nasruddin Shah, which explicitly stated that Iran is, multi-nations, and it's clearly stated there. And the credit goes to Mr. Yusuf Azizi Benitarov, which he has written a fantastic book about that. So I just posted this, emphasizing what Professor Wali mentioned. And the third things that I want to say, just please ask one question. And I also kindly ask the panelists to reply in less than 3 minutes. And I will ask you also to kindly to people that they ask questions to distribute the questions among all panelists, not just targeting 1 or 2. Okay. Thank you very much, Reza Jan. Ali Reza, is your turn.
Yes, thank you. But Jafar, Dr. Sheikh al-Islami is long waiting. I'm not sure.
It's okay, to be honest. I'm fine. I would like to hear from the audience more questions. That's fine. I can express myself on other occasions.
Thank you very much. So next participant with a question is I have Sahar Motalabi. With that's the only participant with her hands up.
We have 3 people here: Yasamin, Javad, and Zaniar.
Okay, seems like I couldn't see everyone.
And can I ask the panelists kindly to give us another 10 minutes, and after that we will close sharp at let's say 1:15. Is that okay? Sharp, we will close at 1:15.
Yes.
Thank you.
What happened, Ali? Who's supposed to ask a question?
Oh, the next person in line is Javad Chamanora.
Hello. I hope that you can see or hear me at least.
We can't see you, but we can hear you well.
Okay, great. So possibly I can change my video settings. Sorry for that. Just give me a second. This should solve the problem.
Yes.
Okay, so this is Jawad. I'm a computer scientist, but advocating for digital federalism. So this is another issue, but at the moment, I had a question about the nation. If there is a time, I would like to Mr. Wali and also Professor Licours to explain a little bit on that. What I'm more interested is that when people say that you are a nation, or no, you are not a nation, you are an ethnic, it seems that there are different rights associated with these terms, which is not really obvious what are these terms. This is the first question, but my direct question is to Professor McCulloch about the concept of group autonomy. When you say group autonomy, what I hear from that is like that allocating and fixing some power to some people or some groups, like what we see in Iraq or in Lebanon, which basically reduces the competition and also the competency to some regional groups, so they have the certainty that they will actually get that position. Like, for example, in Iraq, prime minister is always a Shia, and I guess president is always a Kurd. So I was wondering whether this creates some sort of like a special right for some groups and somehow underestimates the democracy. And then it will actually lead to some sort of like non-responsive to the people or to the nation in general. Yeah, thank you. I'll be listening.
Yeah, I might start, and I'll do it quickly. So I think you're right. The nation is a very political term. So it's connected to self-determination. So states typically don't like to see different nations within, right? They like to see only one. And in terms of what is a nation compared to an ethnic group and all of that, well, that's lots of academic debates around that. I like there's a book from 1977 by Hugh Seton Watson, and the first page 1, he basically says, if enough members of a group tell you that they are a nation, then they are a nation, and that's my understanding of it. That it's not about having different criteria. It's about considering oneself a nation. To me, that's the criteria, if you will, a very subjective one. But I mean, it's kind of politically anyway. It's kind of useless to argue with a group who tells you, "Well, we are a nation." Say, "No, you're not." So this type of dialogue, this type of conversation, it never goes anywhere. So.
Okay, so maybe then continuation of that with Professor Valley, what are the rights that are associated with it? Especially I saw you today that are insisting on the Kurds are a nation, or the country is a multi-nation system. So then it means that there is a difference for you, what is a nation and what is an ethnic group.
Well, I think with nation, what, legally, politically, in what sense? Legally, politically, I mean, what the dividing line is political sovereignty.
Okay.
That a nation is considered legally as a sovereign entity, is running, but not ethnic group is not a sovereign entity. It has nothing to do with the number of people living in that ethnic group or in that nation. It's a political arrangement related to sovereignty. But as a matter of fact, I mean, if you look at it, actually, it's just the argument which was made. It is a kind of identity. If people
right.
do subscribe to that identity, do hold that identity, it's very difficult to argue that you are not.
Right.
You don't have that argument. But there are a lot of people. What other than that? I mean, what would be the difference between a nation and ethnicity? I mean, I think, if I'm not wrong, I think it was Ernest Gellner said that the difference between a nation and an ethnic group is simply a large army, and that was his argument, that it is simply a large army. That nation has that large army, but the ethnic group does not have it. So this is the idea of political, if you like, domination or political superiority or political power or what have you. So I think legally, politically, it is the principle of sovereignty, which gives that right. It's indivisible, it's unquestionable. Everything that is wrong in politics is associated with sovereignty. And everything which is wrong in politics, it is unquestionable. It is a point where critical thought stops. It is where, if the idea of national treason starts, and everything that really is, you read Carl Schmitt for essays on sovereignty. That's what it say. That sovereignty is basically is the only concept in political theory. It simply is unquestionable.
Thank you very much.
It's where critical reason stops.
Thank you.
So that's the difference. Yes.
Just for the sake of time, let's be mindful of time. We only have 5 more minutes of our extended timeline. Thank you very much. Obviously, these are hot topics. These are all interesting topics. And
Ali, I think a part of the question was for Susan.
Alison.
Alison.
yeah,
Alison,
that's fine.
Yeah, and I'll be quick, but I did see it. It was in the chat as well, and then I got caught up in Professor Vali's talk and didn't get a chance to respond to it. So, yeah, I think it's a really important question, and is one of the risks that comes along with the kinds of power sharing arrangements that predetermine who gets what, right? So that if you reserve particular posts for particular groups, then even if demographic changes might want to recalibrate that, it's very difficult to reform it. And so that is one of the risks of reserving posts. The other challenge is that it treats power as something that you can carve up and each, so rather than actually something that you're sharing, it's something that you're sort of each person is, or each group is keeping a piece for itself. And that's why there is a lot of sort of academic literature on finding more flexible ways of ensuring that societal diversity is represented in the executive and the parliament and so on, in ways that don't lock in particular configurations over time. And so that's where things like relying on having a share, a certain percentage of parliamentary seats might give you access to a position in cabinet and that kind of thing, rather than allocating it to a specific group, because there are some risks that come along with that, both in the short and in the long term. So there are other ways of doing these, sort of designing institutions that can be a little bit more flexible, but still get that diversity represented.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And correct me if I'm wrong, Ibrahim, but this was the last question. This was the last raised hand.
Well, I can say that since it's a woman life freedom, let's ask Yasemin to ask a question, and that will be the last question. Then you have 1 minute to conclude, Ali. Okay. And my apologies, Professor Sheikh al-Islami. I know that you had a question, but you are so kind that always you offer another time to share your thoughts. Yeah. Yes, Yasemin?
Hi, can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I just want to continue off of what Professor Abbas Vali said, but this is a general question I want to open up for the entirety of the panel. So you mentioned that Reza Shah abolished the tribal systems in the 1930s, and it was the 1930s where, oh, sorry, you didn't?
No, I said this political organization of tribes.
Ah, the political
That's very different, yeah. And his son, Muhammad Reza Shah, basically destroyed the large land ownership, which was the economic foundation of tribal power.
Economic foundation. Perfect. Thank you so much for the clarification.
Yes.
There was a lot of historical data that comes in here that leads to my question. So just bear with me. I'm going to quickly go over this. There was a import of what was foreign politics from 1930s Germany that resulted in this idea of the development of ethno-nationalism that was very prevalent, especially in the 1950s, where we see the remnants of that in the current political regime, where what would be Afghans, or what we colloquially call as Koli, or in English would be the word gypsies, or Romani population aren't even considered citizens. So they not only have no legal protection, they have no voting rights, they have absolutely no say in it. And this was an ideology that was imported by was considered the West. And we still see this power imbalance among the ethnic majority who refuse to give up their kind of comfort and their power simply because it would mean for them to lose this sense of superiority. And we see this as a problem when it comes to developing a federalist society. Is it possible to implement sort of like coalition or a committee of equity, diversity, and inclusion that operates on all levels of government and works alongside grassroots organization to implement changes in institutions, so macro level and overall society's perception of politics, such as macro and mezzo, which later on trickles down into influencing micro perceptions, but it operates on all levels of government, be it municipal, provincial, and national, which also I'd like to clarify equity instead of equality. So in Farsi, we would say haq, not just barobari, which would include tailoring to people's specific problems and implementing this in not only a federalist society, but also implementing it in the laws to ensure equal and equitable participation and legal protection. How would that how would you see that being a possibility, and how would that apply to Iran's government?
You're asking me.
I'm asking in general for anyone who would like to add on to it, because I think this is often a very complicated discussion in political science. So it's up for any of the professors who'd like to answer.
Alison?
Sure, I can take a first stab at that. That's a great question, and a really important reminder that that we all have, again, is nested or multiple kinds of identities that need to be represented in political spaces. And so that need for, as you say, equity, diversity, and inclusion is vitally important, but to recognize that there are various different ways in which that manifests, or sort of taking a more sort of intersectional approach to our understanding of institutions. How to go about doing that in institutional design and policy is an ongoing question in a lot of different places. And so many places, particularly in policy, now policymaking will take a gender perspective or an EDI perspective to sort of think about the consequences of these decisions for marginalized communities, and to think about the different ways in which this might, again, impact different groups in different ways. So one of the ways in which you could start to bring some of this in would be in those kinds of policy making spaces. So when new legislation is being proposed and that kind of thing, making sure that you have a full sense of how these decisions will impact communities. But I think it comes back to sort of, and there was a question sort of in the chat as well about that idea, and as Andre talked about, the idea of federal society, or that understanding of and recognition and acceptance of the diversity of society and the need to work with that. And that's an ongoing project, I think, in a lot of different places, but it's about finding those places for dialogue between different communities. So that's a pretty broad answer, but I think it's one of the ways in which to start to think about the consequences of political choices.
Thank you very much, Alison. With this, I would like to conclude this this session. We're at time, actually 2 minutes over the extended 15 minutes time. So with all due respect, I have to terminate this. Although we need to talk about these issues. We need to talk more. We need to be able to listen more as Iranians, as people who are looking forward to a free and democratic Iran, and ultimately a free and democratic Middle East, which is necessary for the stability of this planet. Like, look at the other countries, look at the superpowers. What are they doing right now? What is in their schedule? What are USA, Canada, G8 countries, G20 countries, what are they talking about right now? They're talking about goals for humanity. We are talking right now in Canada, one of the hottest discussions is about moving towards decarbonization, because we as humans are recognizing that our resources are limited. And this planet, who gave us everything, is not on a very good path. So in order for humanity to succeed with these goals, we need uniformity, we need peace, we need global peace. And one of the factors is a stable and democratic Middle East. Everybody can agree on that. And to conclude this session, obviously, I'm greatly thankful to all of the panelists, Ibrahim, for hosting this this session, one of many to come. We would have more sessions, hopefully in future, talking about Iran, talking about possible, potential, useful methods, systems of governance for our beloved country, our beloved motherland. And just to finish this discussion, I would like to give an example to the participants in this meeting. And the example is Canada. In Canada, like the panelists mentioned, like Andrea started with this mention, in Canada, we have this federal system. In Canada, there are 10 provinces and 3 territories, each of which have their own representatives in the House of Commons. In the House of Commons in Canada, there are 338 seats. Right now, Quebec has 78 seats in the House of Commons. And a party in Quebec, one of the federal parties in Canada, is the Bloc Québécois. Now, Bloc Québécois, by definition, is looking forward for a sovereign Quebec as a country. And in their efforts, in collaboration with the provincial parties like Parti Québécois in Quebec, they've tried to get separated from Canada. And this is the beauty of democracy. Now, when we talk about separatists, when we talk about Kurds who want to get separated from Iran, when we talk about pan-Turks who want to create a state of Azerbaijan, these are right now Iranian people. But in future, if there is democracy in Iran in any form, those people can gather, bring their demands to the table, and if not met, they can hold a very good and observable referendum to get separated, like Quebec did twice, although not successful, but they can still try. So we need to listen to each other. We need to learn from these panels. We need to learn from the trial and errors done by the other countries. And as Churchill once famously said, or might not have said, that democracy is the worst form of governance, except for all the other ones that we have tried and failed. So we are looking forward for democracy in Iran. And the way is clear, the road is clear. We have to listen more to each other, and we have to accept one another. And with this, thank you very much for your participation, and we hope for a future free Iran, Zan, Zendegi, Azadi. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andre, Alison, Abbas, and Ali, as well as my colleague from Pand Kaveh, which he really did an amazing job. And thanks to all of the audiences for staying with us. There were about 10 people on the YouTube channel, but I'm sure that they will see it, and we'll provide you feedback if it's needed, if you need, and for sure we'll share the question with you. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.